when I go in search of the African presence in China, and I want to come and tell everybody about what I found. Or if I go to Vietnam looking for black people, I want to be able to come to the forum and say, well, this was my experience in Vietnam, or Peru, or Cambodia, whatever. But in New York and New Jersey, they're kind of getting tired of that. And they wanted to challenge me. So a good friend of mine had the nerve to ask me to do a presentation, and this is what he called it: an expose of Greek culture, father of Western civilization, looking at the abnormal, bizarre, deviant nature of the Greeks. I'm just reading from the flyer here. This is a place called African Echoes in Newark, New Jersey. It says, this slide presentation will rock you. The information is from the Greeks themselves, but hidden from Greekophiles, calling all alphas, deltas, kappas, and other Africans who aspire to identify with and relate to Greece and neglect Mother Africa. This was the last presentation in the world I wanted to do. But what I did is I said, okay, brother, I agree. And I agreed to do the presentation. And then in order to promote the presentation, I posted it over the internet. And so when Brother Seko knew that I was coming down here, he had the audacity to say, Runoko, that's the same presentation we want you to do. So now I find myself stuck doing it again. And I'm not going to go through all this, but you see, most of the time when I do a presentation, I don't even have notes or outlines or anything. I know my stuff that well. But in this case, I brought 38 pages of notes. And you know I'm not going to go through all of that. I'm going to summarize this and synthesize it and try to pick out the most important parts, and then I'm going to do a slide presentation that looks at the African presence in Greece and Africans in Europe in general. That's what we're going to do tonight, okay? All right. And we're going to save a little time for you all to buy some books. Those of you who have not, you have your opportunity to get one autographed tonight, and we'll ask the sisters to dance and the brothers to drum one more time, okay? But give Brother Seko and the Imani Foundation a warm round of applause. Now, in preparation of this lecture, somebody gave me this, a friend of mine, and I'll read it. I think you'll get a laugh or two out of this, and in a sense, it kind of summarizes, I guess it sets the tone for what we're going to do. This is called Deserted Island. It's kind of funny. Let me sit down. On a beautiful deserted island in the middle of nowhere, the following people are suddenly stranded as you might expect by a shipwreck. You have two Italian men. Now don't get mad now. I'm glad there's no black people in this. You have two Italian men and one Italian woman, two French men and one French woman, two German men and one German woman, two Greek men and one Greek woman, two English men and one English woman, two Bulgarian men and one Bulgarian woman, two Japanese men and one Japanese woman, two Chinese men and one Chinese woman, two American men and one American woman, two Irish men and one Irish woman. 1 month later, on the same absolutely stunning deserted island in the middle of nowhere, the following things have occurred. One Italian man killed the other Italian man for the Italian woman. The two French men and the French woman are living happily together in a menage a trois. I think that's how you pronounce it. The two German men have a strict weekly schedule of alternating visits with the German woman. The two Greek men are sleeping with each other, and the Greek woman is cleaning and cooking for them. The two English men are waiting for someone to introduce them to the English woman. The two Bulgarian men who took one long look at the endless ocean and another long look at the Bulgarian woman and started swimming. The two Japanese men have faxed Tokyo and are awaiting instructions. The two Chinese men have set up a pharmacy, a liquor store, a restaurant, and a laundry, have gotten the woman pregnant in order to supply employees for their store. The two American men are contemplating the virtues of suicide because the American woman keeps endlessly complaining about her body, the true nature of feminism, how she can do everything they can do, the necessity of fulfillment, the equal division of household chores, how sand and palm trees make her look fat, how her last boyfriend respected her opinion and treated her nicer than they do, how her relationship with her mother is improving, and how at least the taxes are low and it isn't raining. And the two Irishmen divided the island into north and south and set up a distillery. They do not remember if sex is in the picture because it gets sort of foggy after the first few liters of coconut whiskey, but they're satisfied because at least the English aren't having any fun. This was supposed to be somebody's idea of introducing this subject because it deals with the nature, in a sense, of Greek civilization. Nobody laughed. I hope you thought it was amusing. Let me begin by saying that Greece is important to us because people pretty much regard it, as you know, Greco-Roman civilization as the parent civilization of the Western Hemisphere. And, you know, you even have a term called the classics that's almost completely confined to the study of Greco-Roman civilization. When people talk about the classics, they're usually not talking about Africa and not really Asia very much either. Greece is a relatively large country, as you know, in the southern part of Europe. It is very rocky, it's fairly barren, and it's not a very prosperous country. And the Greeks are also important to us because of their relationship with ancient Egypt. Now, Greece is not the first civilization in ancient Europe. As a matter of fact, the first civilization attributed to Europe is really not European at all. It's a place called Minoan Crete. I mean, has anybody in the room been to Egypt? Okay. Well, did you fly from the United States when you went to Egypt? Well, if you fly from the United States like I have, particularly from New York, and you leave Egypt like I have done, you fly from Cairo to New York in the daytime. Usually the flights are in the morning. And you find yourself flying over the Mediterranean Sea. And when you're taking off, you're flying low enough to fly over an island called Crete. And Crete is midway between northern Africa and southern Europe. And it's in Crete that many people associate the first civilization in Europe. But Crete is really not in Europe per se, not in mainland Europe at least. It's in the Aegean Sea. And the people of Minoan Crete, it is believed, had their origins in northern Africa too. This is what one person said. The first civilization of Europe was established on the island of Crete. It is sometimes called the Minoan culture after King Minos, an early legendary ruler of the island. The ancestors of the Cretans were native of Africa, a branch of the Western Ethiopians. I went into Ethiopia quite a bit yesterday. This person says they dwelt in the grasslands of North Africa before that area dried up and became a great desert. As the Sahara sands encroached on their homeland, they took to the sea, and in Crete and the neighboring islands set up a maritime culture. Crete had strong relationships with Egypt, and it was from Crete that civilization itself seems to have been transmitted into the mainland of Europe. As a matter of fact, the Europeans at that time in Greece were very rude, uncultured people. They didn't even have a word for bathing or bathtub. These words come from Crete. You also have some information about direct Egyptian contacts with Greece, particularly through the reign of somebody named Mcgrath. He is a legendary king of Egyptian origin, and he is supposed to have founded the Greek city of Thebes. We know a little bit about the Greeks in terms of their culture because of studies that have been done about their neighbors. For example, the Greeks had neighbors called the Scythians, and the Scythians were very warlike and aggressive. This gives you some idea as to the practice of the Scythians. It says when a king died, they hauled his body from tribe to tribe. After having embalmed it in the Egyptian manner, the body was smeared with wax. The abdomen, after being emptied of its entrails and cleaned out, was filled with aromatics and sewn up again. And they just go on to talk about how the people mutilated themselves in grief out of the king. One person says that although the Greeks are identified with philosophy, they knew nothing of that study before coming under the influence of the ancient Egyptians. And you have many of the preeminent Greek philosophers and scientists. This is from the book by Will Durant called The Life of Greece. He says from the 7th century onward, many famous Greeks, Thales, Pythagoras, Solon, Plato, and Democritus may serve as examples, visited Egypt and were much impressed by the fullness and antiquity of the culture. Here were no barbarians, but men who had a mature civilization and developed arts 2,000 years before the fall of Troy. You Greeks, said an Egyptian priest to Solon, and Solon is an uncle of Plato, are mere children, talkative and vain, and knowing nothing of the past. Most of the gods of ancient Greece, according to some of the early accounts, are also derived from Egypt. You have, for example, I mentioned, I think last night, or really didn't get a chance to get into it very much, how you have the Egyptian god Aphrodite. Not the Egyptian god, actually the Egyptian god, the name of the goddess is Het-Heru. And she is the goddess of love, beauty, and sensuality. But she is adopted into the Greek pantheon and called Aphrodite. And in Greece, she becomes a very different kind of person. In Greece, in the sense, she becomes a whore. In ancient Greece, the goddess Aphrodite is a promiscuous woman. In ancient Egypt, the same goddess is considered the goddess of love, beauty, and sensuality, and the goddess of the marriage bed. The term aphrodisiac is derived from Aphrodite. And the Romans are to take this same goddess and call her Venus. And we know that she assumes a similar amoral character. And we have other words that derive from that. For example, the term venereal disease means the diseases of Venus. So I'm just trying to show here how in ancient Africa you have a certain kind of character. And this is transformed when we get to ancient Greece itself. You have, interestingly enough, when you look at the gods of ancient Greece, also a very different character. For example, Zeus. The king of the gods in ancient Greece is a rapist. And he, if you look at Greek mythology, in fact, I'm reading from a book called Ancient Greece Now. It says, Zeus rapes apparently refer to the Hellenic conquest of the goddess's ancient shrines. And Zeus was not particular about who he raped, sometimes young boys and sometimes young girls. For example, many people are not aware that the name Europe itself is derived from a Phoenician or African princess that Zeus was able to seduce and take to this island called Crete, and there she gave the name to a continent. You have, I wonder if I should continue with this. Is this appropriate with these children here? Or should I just give a presentation on the African origins in Europe? I know that may sound abrupt. Would that be more apropos? Because this is for a more scholarly audience. I was expecting to do this at the university. And maybe what we should do is just save some of this for the question and answer period. What do you think, Seko? Okay. Sister, did you have your hand up there?
Yeah, I did. Okay.
All right, I want to satisfy everybody. I'm going to show the slides, and I'll introduce it as I go. Let's go. And the child had to pay that education. He had to pay for that tuition. Another factor would be the status of women, how in Egypt women were so highly advanced and prominent, and whereas at the same time in Greece the female was next to nothing. That in ancient Greece a female is never independent. As a child she belonged to her father, as an adult her husband, and if she outlived her husband she belongs to her sons. Another important thing about Greek civilization, such as it was the treatment of children, particularly the abandonment of children. You had a policy whereby a child was brought before the father, and the father had the prerogative to pick up the child, and if so, to bestow citizenship upon the child. But quite often the child would simply be left there. And this is where we get the concept of child abandonment. In Sparta, one of the heartlands of ancient Greece, you not only have the abandonment of children sometimes, but even if the father approved of the child was taken before a council of elders. And quite often, if the child was shown to be defective, they would be tossed off a cliff. This begins this long concept of child abandonment. There's a book that I referenced the other day called The Kindness of Strangers, and it's all about the abandonment of children in the history of Europe. And Europeans will come to Africa and will be amazed by the fact that Africans raised all their children. Now let me show you some images of Africans in Greece. But before I do that, let me show this particular slide right here. And this is the one I showed yesterday. A lot of you may not have gotten a chance to see it. And every time I get an opportunity, I show this picture now of the Black Christ from the Coptic Museum. And this is 1,800 years old. It's a very, very good piece, and it looks even better in the setting that we have tonight. An earlier version of something similar to that comes from the European city of Constantinople itself, and this piece is about 1,600 years old. And this is another variation of the iconography of Jesus the Christ. And of course, this precedes by more than 1,000 years the depiction of Christ that Michelangelo did. And Michelangelo used as models his uncle and his cousin. This is the picture I told you I was going to show yesterday because it's so topical. This is a depiction of a black man in ancient Afghanistan. And what I try to do whenever I give these presentations is not just a history lesson, but also a geography lesson. Because all over the world, in places that you rarely suspect there to be, you will find an African presence. Now, to begin with, even before we get to Greece, one or two other slides. This is a photograph that shows African people in Greece for the first time. You know that African people or black people are the aboriginal people of humankind. They move all over the world, and Europe is no exception to that. And then you have those Africans who move into Europe and impact European civilization. We've already talked a little bit about Crete and how Crete was established for the most part by refugees fleeing from northern Egypt at the time that the two lands or the dynastic period is beginning. And they go into Crete and take their African traditions with them. And then, of course, Crete has a big influence on Europe itself, particularly Greece. And then you have the role that Africans played much later on. And again, this is the third phase. And these are Africans who are pretty much brought into Europe as servants and slaves. So we'll cover all of that briefly tonight and try to look at it from another perspective. This is the Venus of Willendorf. This picture is about 30,000, this image is about 30,000 years old. It's made of soapstone, and it's only about 4 inches high. I've actually seen the artifact, and it was found in southern Austria in the late 19th century. If you look at the hair and you look at the hips, authors would use this to show that two things. First, that you have a strong African presence, but also a strong presence of African women who more or less may have been identified as goddesses. You have an early practice of agriculture. Now, when the Europeans, the Indo-Europeans, come into Europe, they are mostly nomadic and they're horsemen for the most part. They don't have an agricultural tradition. And so the Europeans of today pretty much displace this ancient African population. Does that make sense? And this just shows the comparative physical makeup. This is the sister today from the Andaman Islands. And these folk right here represent what some of the earliest humans in the world must have looked like. And these sisters and brothers traveled all over the world and survived now only in isolated areas. You find pockets of them, for example, in the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. You have this group right here from the Andaman Islands, a small island chain in the Indian Ocean. But these folks traveled everywhere because we find records of them, particularly in the mythology and folk tales. And undeniably, sisters like this, black people like this, went into Europe. Now, this is also another piece from ancient Europe, and this takes us back to about 2,500 years ago. This is actually from southern Europe, in a place called the Crimea. And this is a depiction of a black woman, and here she is in the form of some kind of libation container. But this takes us to Crete itself. This is about 1700 BC, or roughly 3,700 years ago. And this is the shell inlay of a black man from ancient Crete. And again, Crete is the purveyor or conveyor of civilization into Europe itself. Now, these things take us to Greece proper. And this might reflect what you might consider part of that deviant, what I would consider bizarre, and for us, abnormal behavior. Now, one of the things that intrigued me from the beginning, when I was just a little child, I took an active interest in reading, and naturally, like most children, I like to watch TV. And I remember when my favorite character in television was Hercules. You had a Hercules cartoon show, kind of like Mighty Mouse or something like that, and the theme song was even similar. Hercules has come to save the day. And then you would see these movies that went back to the late 50s and early 1960s, starring Steve Reeves as the legendary strongman. And then I read Marvel comic books, and I was very big on that. And they had these mythological personalities like Thor and Hercules and what have you. And like most youth, like most young boys, naturally I was drawn to that, the idea of this super strong man who we all wanted to emulate. And as I got older and began to develop an African consciousness, I began to collect photographs and even began to study a little bit about the African presence in early Europe, I wanted to find a photograph of Hercules that was black. And so I grew up in Los Angeles, and I went to Cal State Northridge and UCLA, and I worked in the Los Angeles Public Library, the biggest library in Southern California at that time. And lo and behold, I finally did find a photograph of Hercules, and this is the one I found. This picture is called Hercules in Search of His Son. And here is Hercules right here, big buff brother. And I was very satisfied with this picture for a long time because it served my needs. And then about a year or so after I got the picture, and I showed it a number of times, people began to say, well, Runoko, there's a lot of stuff going on in that photograph that had not occurred to me before. And let us go from individual to individual. Now, this is Hercules closest to me. Hercules is okay. But Hercules, in the attention of most of the people, is down towards the bottom of the photograph. On the throne is a Greek goddess named Arcadia. And you have African deities in Greek mythology. For example, you have a man named Memnon. Memnon is the most heroic of the non-Hellenic heroes of antiquity. He's the most celebrated non-Hellenic figure in Greek mythology. And tradition has it that Memnon came to Troy when the Greeks were trying to attack and defeat the Trojans. You know the story of the Trojan War and the Trojan horse, I'm sure, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Well, you have the Greeks led by people like Achilles, who himself was a strange person. Achilles is the person who was dipped into this body of water when he was a young child. And his mother held him up by his heel. The idea of dipping him into this special water was that it would make him invulnerable. You could not harm him. But she had to hold him up, and she held him by the heel. And this is called Achilles' heel. This, when people say sometimes they use an expression Achilles' heel, that means you only have one weakness. And in this case, it was in his heel. And when Achilles was finally killed, Achilles was one of the most powerful figures among the Greeks that went to Troy. Somebody informed, the gods informed the enemies of Achilles that the only way you could kill him was to shoot him in the heel with an arrow, and that's how he died. And you have others like Agamemnon, and Ajax, and Odysseus, or Ulysses. All of them went to Troy. And all of them in their own way was very strange. For example, Ulysses glorified theft. He was very clever, but for him, the best way to solve a problem was to steal something. And theft will come to his mind before any other avenue. Achilles was rather bizarre and deviant himself. While he is a great soldier, he is a very sick person. Among the Trojans are many people who are not Trojans themselves, but the Trojans' allies. And they come to Troy to help save their allies. And one is a woman, a black woman, who is called an Amazon. And she and Achilles battle each other. And Achilles finally vanquishes her in battle, kills her. Thank you, African. And after he kills her, he has sex with the dead body on the battlefield. This is written in Greek mythology. And even the other Greeks said, wow, Achilles, you've gone too far, right? So this is something similar here. You have the goddess Arcadia. I don't know who the black figure is above Arcadia, you know, who seems to be more amused than anybody else. Arcadia seems to be very disturbed or perturbed by something. And then you have the figure above Hercules with the wings on like an angel. And then that person is pointing down at the floor. And down at the floor is a little white child sucking on the bottom of a deer. And so this might reflect more than any other image that I'm going to show a kind of strange personality of ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, you never find a woman who was the head of a Greek city-state. It is a male-dominant society. You also have far more slaves than free people. And yet this is the country that many people identify as the birthplace of civilization. So there's Hercules, and there's a lot of sickness going on in that film. I mean, in that photograph. This is a depiction of the black goddess, or the goddess, Pallas Athena. Now, Pallas Athena is the patron deity of the Greek city of Athens. She is identified by Plato, among others, as an Egyptian goddess or an African goddess named Night, who came from northern Africa, and is kind of just like Heru was taken into or confiscated in a sense in Greek mythology. Night the same thing happens to her. But they don't call her night, they call her Pallas Athena. And Pallas Athena is probably the most important goddess in the Greek pantheon. She is the goddess of warfare, but she's also the goddess of weaving. And she's also a goddess associated with the intellect. And she is the patron deity of the Greek city of Athens. Pallas Athena is her name. And here she is portrayed in the perfect black. Now, this is an interesting piece, too, because this reflects, this is an image of a woman in early Greece. Now, I don't know if you could say this is a black or African woman, but sometimes Africans exert themselves also in a cultural form. And so, for example, you would look at the hair as perhaps an African motif. And these are actually African people or black people in early Greece itself. This is a young lady from a place called Corinth. Corinth is a very important city in ancient Greece. You have other cities like Athens, Sparta, Thebes, among others. But Corinth is one of the most important ones. And Corinth has a reputation as being one of the fountainheads for Christianity in ancient Greece. I think many people have heard of the city of Corinth. And this is a beautiful marble piece. Now, sometimes people ask me where I get these photographs from. And it's not easy. Sometimes I take them in the course of my own travels. Sometimes I get postcards. Sometimes people send them to me. And that's why I quite often do not allow my presentations to be videotaped. Only on special occasions, because some of these images are not mine. And so I'm very reluctant to allow other people to tape stuff that doesn't belong to me anyway, and that I'm just using in the course of a presentation. But this one I cut out of a magazine. This was a magazine with an article by a man named Frank Snowden, who is a black man who doesn't quite think he's black. I think he went to Harvard, and then he taught at Howard University for a long time. And he's the sort of person that even today, although he reads and understands archaic Greek, who will argue that there were no black people in ancient Egypt. And this is a black man. And he will say that people like Sheikh Anta Diop and Ivan Van Sertima are lying to the people. But nevertheless, he's done a better job than anybody living, maybe anybody in history, of compiling images of the African presence in ancient Greece. His name is Frank Snowden. And he has an excellent book called Blacks in Antiquity, the Greco-Roman Experience, and another book called Before Color Prejudice. He argues that there was a time when color prejudice did not exist. I have a real issue with that. But anyway, he put this magazine article together, and this is a photograph in it that I found to be just exquisite. And while I use the piece right here, one of my favorite photographs, and this is of a black man from ancient Greece as well, and this piece is in the Brooklyn Museum in Brooklyn, New York. And this is made of marble. This takes us to the 2nd century BC. And this, again, just reflects the African presence in ancient Greece. This is a really, really nice piece. And I believe it's made of marble. It has streaks in it, but perhaps, it just conveys the African character and image so strongly. Isn't that a nice photograph? And look at the hair. And let me give you a close-up of that. This one right here. Now, this is the picture that I took. And it really captures the details. Now, you can see so many young Africans wearing their hair like that today. And I don't know if they wear it because they're proud of being African or it commemorates their African heritage. It might just be instinctive. Sometimes I wonder how much we have fallen back, and every now and then I too begin to wonder if we really are making progress, or if we really are losing it, or perhaps have lost it. Some of my scholar teachers who are ancestors now believe that slavery broke us as a people, that in spite of all the great things that we have done, that the slave experience was so brutal that perhaps it put us in a position where we would never rise again. Now, I don't believe that, but sometimes you do wonder if we just have not accepted defeat. There's a so-called Negro spiritual that says, I've been down so long, it's beginning to look like up to me. That we've been down for so long that perhaps many of us have accepted the status quo as normal. That maybe white folks are supposed to dominate us. Anyway, beautiful piece. This is a photograph that I was able to get in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And this too is an African from ancient Greece. Now you notice here, the thing that stands out is the nose is missing as well. Now I showed you, if you've seen me over the last day or so, you've seen many of the slides that I've shown you with missing noses. And I keep saying all the time that I would like to encourage someone young, perhaps someone who's about to graduate from school, maybe someone who's interested in history and looking for something new to pursue, just theoretically speaking, to do a research project on the missing noses of African people. Okay? Because it's a profound study in Greeks, and just compare and see how many times the faces is missing, or the nose is missing. Now this is a depiction of Aesop. Aesop figures very prominently too, because we've all heard of Aesop's fables. And the traditions tell us that Aesop was an Ethiopian who had the misfortune of being captured in enslavement. If you want to get a pretty good synopsis on Aesop, there's a book that you ought to get a hold of. And I went to an excellent bookstore this afternoon. I had the pleasure, my brother took me around, and you have some very good bookstores here. But one book that you ought to get a hold of, if you don't have it already, is called World's Great Men of Color. And it's written by the great historian J.A. Rogers. And it has brief biographies in there that are very, very good, including the biography of Aesop. So this is from Rogers' World's Great Men of Color, Aesop. Now this takes us to ancient Rome. And that same African tradition is there. For example, in the 2nd century A.D., you had at least 1/3 of all the members of the Roman Senate who are born in Africa. All right? You have, of course, Hannibal Barca and the Barca family from Carthage, who dominated parts of Europe for a long time. The Carthaginians are the descendants of people from a place called Phoenicia and North Africans who set up a nation state in northern Africa. It's called Carthagis, or the New Town. And it comes to us as Carthage. And the Carthaginians and the Romans fought each other for a long time. First, the Carthaginians fought the Greeks. And the leading family of Carthaginians was the Barca family, B-A-R-C-A. And many people would even say that the Barca family is responsible for founding the Spanish city of Barcelona. Now, the greatest of the Barcas is Hannibal Barca, who is known as the king of the lion's brood. The Barca family is known as the lion's brood. And when Hannibal was a young boy, he swore undying hatred to the Roman Empire because they were trying to wipe the Carthaginians out. And when he was in his early 20s, he was elected democratically commander-in-chief of the Carthaginian army. And it was Hannibal's idea that the Romans could never be defeated on African soil, that in order to defeat them, they would have to go into Europe. And so you have the famous episode of Hannibal crossing the Alps with an army of elephants. And many of his soldiers were wiped out. And yet he went to Italy, and he came very close to defeating the Romans. The Romans were able to get one army after the other, and eventually they wore the Carthaginians down. Now the Roman general who led the defeat of the Carthaginians ultimately in a series of 3 wars called the Punic Wars is named Scipio Africanus. And some people would even think this is where we get the modern word Africa. I don't think so. I think that he got the name Africanus because he probably implied that he was a conqueror of Africa. And there's a Scipio Africanus elder and a Scipio Africanus younger. Y'all still following me?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, this is a beautiful piece right here. I photographed not nearly as good, and this is a young boy, young African, a youth, also in Rome. But the quality of the work is not nearly as good. You have in Rome the tradition of a man named Terence Afar, who is regarded as one of the greatest writers in Roman history. He is he wrote comedies. And it is Terence Afar, Terence Niger, or Terence the Black who came up with the expression, I am a man, and therefore nothing human is alien to me. He's studied by Julius Caesar, by Cicero, by Horace, and later by William Shakespeare. St. Miltiades, the first African pope that I'm aware of, is a man named Victor, or Victor I, who becomes pope, I think, in 195 or thereabouts. And he is pontiff for about 5 years. And then the second one is Miltiades that we see portrayed here. And the third one is a man named St. Gelasius. So you have at least 3 African popes at Rome. And then you have at least 3, 4, 5 that I know of African emperors of Rome. The most powerful of them is this man here, Septimius Severus. Now, Septimius Severus was actually born in a place called, I think, Lepta Magna in northern Africa, a country that today would be identified as Libya. He became emperor of Rome. He is the emperor from around 181 to about 199 AD. He is a warrior emperor. He is the last emperor to die in bed in Rome for about 200 years. And one of the most interesting, he died in England, I think leading military campaigns there. And one of the most interesting things about him is that he actually went on a triumphant homecoming tour to Africa. And it didn't work out necessarily for the best. In Egypt, Egypt was a place that pilgrims and tourists wanted to go to from the most ancient times. As a matter of fact, if you've been in Egypt, you can go to some of the temples and you can see graffiti that goes back to the Greco-Roman period. Almost 2,000 years old. So a lot of people wanted to visit Egypt even back then, and he was no exception. So he went to Egypt with an entourage, and while he was there, he saw two remarkable statues of a man named Amenhotep III. And one of the statues was known every morning, I've seen the statue myself, was known every morning to make a singing or whistling sound. A musical sound, a note would come from the statue every morning at sunrise. And nobody could figure out how it was done. I guess it was something in the architecture of the statues themselves. But they were in a state of disrepair. And so Septimius Severus decided, since he had the power, that he would engage his engineers and they would repair the statues. They repaired the statues, but something that they did caused the singing sound to come to an end. And that's a true story. Those statues are called the Colossi of Memnon. They stand on the west bank of the Nile, city of Luxor. Now this takes us to another phase in European history. And again, I hope you will forgive me, but that we have a lot of children in the room tonight, and I knew that I could see, you can get mad at me if you want to, but I could see that a lot of the information that I had prepared was not going to be appropriate. And so I hope you will just bear with me and feel like the presentation that I am giving incorporates a lot of that, but is visual and deals with the fact that we have so many youth in this room tonight. That's a decision that I made and I'm prepared to live with. I know it's not exactly what I had intended to do, but sometimes you just have to adapt and live with the consequences. Now this represents the third phase, or another phase in the African presence in Europe, and this is going beyond Greece and going beyond Greco-Roman civilization itself, and this man is a Moor. Now I notice when I come down here, and when I'm in Washington, D.C., and Atlanta, and Philadelphia, those places in particular, you have a lot of black folks who, in fact, identify themselves as Moors, who do not like to be called African and don't even like to be called black. Now let's look at that. Who were the Moors? I've mentioned the Moors, I mentioned the Carthaginians, and one of the reasons the Carthaginians were so successful is that they had other Africans fighting along with them. And one of the contingents of Africans fighting with the Carthaginians were the Moors. The Moors served as a cavalry detachment in the Carthaginian military, and they were very successful. Now, the word Moor itself, according to Greco-Roman accounts, meant scorched or black. And the term was applied to black populations or indigenous populations in northwest Africa. You find them in antiquity in Libya, in Algeria, and even today you have two countries that bear their names. One is Mauritania, and that's a Latin term, and the other is Morocco. Okay? Now, after they fought against the Romans and the Carthaginians were defeated, the Moors fought alongside the Romans. And they were adopted also in the Roman army. And you have a Roman general and emperor named Trajan who actually had art portraying the Moors with the same kind of hair as the Greco-Roman brothers that I showed you a moment ago. Now, if you survive 25 years of military duty in ancient Rome, according to the old accounts, you would be given Roman citizenship automatically. But you couldn't go back to Africa with the military training and what have you in order that you had received. They would send you somewhere else. And so we find colonies of Moors in places like Romania or Romania. You find them in Yugoslavia. You find Moorish communities 1,500 years ago or more in places like Bosnia or Herzegovina and Serbia. So you have a very ancient African presence even in the Balkans, and they are Moors. And then we see the Moors again. Some of them apparently adopt Judaism as a religion. And you find them in North Africa fighting against the Arabs who invade Africa. Now when the Arabs come into North Africa, officially about 640, 642 AD, they're able to ride across Egypt almost without pause. The Egyptians offer hardly no resistance. Egypt at this time is no longer the Egypt of the pharaohs. Egypt is like a broken reed, or so it is described. And they move across North Africa in towards Algeria, and then the real battle took place. And they were contested by these Moorish people. And at one time, the head of the Moors is a woman named Al-Kahina. She's described, according to the literature, as having thick braided hair or locks and very black skin. And apparently she was the leader of the Moors, and she engaged in a scorched earth policy. She fought the Arabs tooth and nail. And ultimately, as defeat, this is according to the stories, as defeat became inevitable, she told her two sons to go over to the Arabs, accept Islam, and they joined the triumphant surge of Islam into Europe once again. This time, the Moors go into Europe in large numbers in the year 710, and they are led by a man named Tarif. Tarif crossed into Spain and there set up a customs house. And this is where we get the modern word tariff from. And then, but Tarif only led a few hundred across. The next year in 711, a much larger movement crossed, maybe about 10,000 of them, and some Arabs as well, black Arabs and non-African Arabs, because the first people of Arabia are black people as well. And you can still find their descendants today in southern Arabia in particular. In 711, within a few months, they were able to conquer most of southern Spain. Apparently, they made a short stop along the way. And the leader of this movement is a black man named Tariq, T-A-R-I-K. And they stopped at a small place that has borne Tariq's name. The name is Gibraltar, or the rock or mountain of Tariq. One of our scholars, a man named Dr. Ben, says that the person who led the Moors across was named Admir. And he says this is where we derive the modern word admiral from. And then the Moors are led by Tariq in Spain against large armies wherever he found them, against large armies, and the Moors defeat the white Spanish Christians in battle after battle. The white Spanish Christians are led by somebody named Roderick. And Roderick has been a very cruel ruler. He has alienated many groups of people, including the Jews in Spain, the Sephardic Jews. And so the Jews are willing to give support to the Moors because the Moors promised them religious freedom. And even the white Spanish Christians who had been cruelly treated were not resistant to these Moorish movements. At one point, Tariq and his army is confronted by a much larger army led by Roderick, and he addresses his troops pretty much the following words: "My brother, the sea is behind you and the enemy is in front of you. There is nowhere to run. Follow your leader, follow Tariq, for I am determined to trample on the prostrate body of the Roman king." And they kicked butt. And they continued to fight until they got into southern France. They conquered a lot of Portugal, and they went into southern France, and they were finally stopped by a man named Charles Martel, who was the grandfather of Charlemagne. And this stopped the movement of Islam into Europe at that time. Now, Tariq and these black people, called Moors, are not treated very well by the Arabs. And the Arabs take the best land, and Tariq is even publicly whipped by the Arab governor. The Arab governor is subsequently recalled back, and Tariq is said to have gone to the Far East to spread the teachings of Islam. The Moors introduced paved streets, street lights, air conditioning, magnificent libraries. They built cities like Cordoba, Seville, and Granada. They built things like the Alhambra. Some people even credit them as having introduced algebra into Europe. They were very emphatic about public hygiene. At that time, it was the trend in Europe, at least in Spain, for people not to bathe. White Spanish Christians were taught that bathing was a form of vanity and therefore an offense to God. I have a letter in a book called The Story of the Moors in Spain by a white Spanish nun who boasted that in her 66 years of life, she had never washed her body one time. And that was a big thing to her. She said, I have only washed the tips of my fingers to say Mass. And you're talking about funky Broadway. Okay? So the Moors changed all that. They put emphasis on hygiene, on medical science. But the Moors are fierce warriors, and soon they were coming into Europe. They wanted to come to southern Spain so much that some of them actually floated over on tree trunks. And they called southern Spain Al-Andalus, the European variation Andalusia. And the white Spanish Christians were pushed into the northern part of Spain, many of them into the caves of northern Spain, and they fought what they call an 800-year war of liberation to finally kick the Moors out. Now this is a photograph of a Moor from North Africa, a Moorish soldier. And this is, sideways, so let me show it to you. Oftentimes you not find the Moors portrayed in Spain. I guess the Muslims have a prohibition or restrictions about depicting the human form. But this is apparently a Christian painting here. And what you see here are 4 black men and 1 white man. Now, the 2 most prominent black men are Moorish noblemen playing chess. You see a black musician. You see a black person who is in charge of a black servant who is in charge of the white servant. Now, this is something we would rarely see. And this is from a document called the Chess Book of Alfonso the Wise. Alfonso the Wise is the founding Spanish king of the 12th century. Now, you have a tradition of black artistry and music in the Moorish era. For example, you have a brother named Ziryab, Z-I-R-Y-A-B. He's the greatest musician of his time. He is so tough as a musician that he is called the Blackbird. And when he would go to a city in Spain to give a concert, the mayors and the high officials of the city will come out on the road to greet him at the outskirts of the city and give him the keys to the city. He introduced concepts about fashions. For example, it is he who taught Europeans to change their clothes from time to time. He said that at least you should change your clothes every season. He apparently introduced things like how to eat with a fork, with deodorant, with mouthwash, because Europe had fallen into a very dismal state after the collapse of the Roman Empire. One of the things that the Greeks and the Romans did was they conquered Egypt, because the Greeks had an ambivalent attitude towards Africa and Egypt itself. On the one hand, they saw Egypt as the land of the gods, but also a place for conquest. And the Romans did the same thing. Many Roman emperors are enamored of African deities. For example, Caligula set up a shrine to the goddess Isis in Rome. But over a period of time, with the rise of Christianity in Europe, the Romans decided to shut down the Egyptian mystery schools. And this is what inaugurated what is sometimes called the Dark Ages in Europe, or medieval Europe. What the Moors do is pull Europe back up. And the Moors are responsible for re-educating Europe, for bringing Europe back to the point of civilization. And the Moors, more than any other factor, I would say, are responsible for the introduction of the European Renaissance. Their whole concept of arts and learning, you should read about the palaces they constructed, the libraries that they had, the fountains that they had in their gardens. And Moorish Spain was a beautiful place. No question about that. And they re-educated the Europeans. Literacy was highly advanced. Whereas in Europe at that time, for the most part, not even the king could read and write. Anyway, these are most noblemen playing Spain. And then you have a brother with a harp. The Moors are described as black as pitch, black as a raven, black as a crow, black as ink. Nothing white about them but their teeth. You have women among the Moors who are very prominent, so that even though they are Muslims, they are able to achieve a note of distinction. You have Moorish women who become physicians, who become mathematicians, who become philosophers in their own right. You have, to a large extent, freedom of religious expression, so that the Moors and Jews had a fairly harmonious relationship. And there are various Moorish dynasties. I even think that chess is an African-oriented game. And the reason for that is, for no other reason I would point to, is the status of women in relationship to chess. Now, in Egypt, women could rise to the highest positions. I've already mentioned that in the course of my presentations yesterday. And I mentioned today that in Greece, the female was next to nothing, and this typifies ancient European civilization. That you have a society of might makes right, and the strongest shall survive, and the dominance of the male. The male had virtually life and death rights over the female in ancient Europe. In many cases, females were a burden, particularly girl children. They were an extra mouth to feed. This is a cold, harsh, barren land. And so it is a society where a dog becomes a man's best friend. They had to pass laws, sometimes in ancient Greece, for a man to have sex with his wife, because the birth rate was dropping next to nothing. Men were together at war so much of the time, and were together at the hunt so much of the time, that men fell in love with each other. And the trend at the time was for women to develop a boyish kind of mannerism, because otherwise men didn't want to have sex with them. They wanted them to look mannish. And so it's funny today how these trends, in some cases, color us. And I don't know how it came into being, but again, it's ironic to me that now we even call our best friends our dogs. Okay. And the lady seems to like that photograph. I typically give responses like that. This is the ninth piece too, and this reflects the expansion of the Moors and the concept of the Moor. Now, over a period of time, you have black folks who are known as different things. Sometimes it appears they are called blacks. Other times they're called Africans. Sometimes they are called Ethiopian. The word Ethiopia comes to us from the Greeks. It means the land of the burnt-faced people. Other times they are called Moors. And by the 12th or 13th century, the term Moor came to mean black. It was the same thing. And you have all kinds of remarkable stories about Moors. And you have Moors who go to Ireland. You have a story of a black knight called St. Maurice.
That's him.
And, well, there are variations of it. This is St. Maurice, but before we get to St. Maurice, you also have another one called Sir Morian. And Sir Morian is a black knight that we find identified at the round table of King Arthur. He fights with Lancelot. He has a battle with Sir Gawain. And he becomes, over a period of time, the greatest of the knights of the Arthurian legend. The story goes that the Knights of the Round Table were having a feast one afternoon, and a big black knight rode up, and he was all cut up and bloody. And he fell off his horse around the round table. And so the knights revived him and asked him to tell them their tale. Tell them his tale. And he is in search of his father. His father was a European knight who had gone to Palestine during one of the Crusades, met Morian's mother, had sex with her and got her pregnant, and then left. And so Morian was looking for his father. He had a bone to pick with him. And he chases him all over Europe. And there's actual books called the Romance of Mauryan. And Mauryan is described as the greatest knight in European Christendom. So not all the Moors were Muslims, and this is an example of that. This is Saint Maurice. And Saint Maurice is the patron saint of the Holy Roman Germanic Empire for about 300 years. This piece is actually from a place called Magdeburg in Germany. And it's life-size. It was carved in 1240 AD in front of a cathedral. And it's still there right now. Some shrines to St. Maurice went as far north as Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia in the Baltic states. Now, St. Maurice was a Christian knight, and the tradition was that he came from southern Egypt, and he worked for the Roman Empire as a soldier, a commander of a legion. And his contingent from Egypt was sent to Switzerland to put down an uprising by the Roman emperor. What Maurice did not know is that the people that he was supposed to suppress were Christians, and he was a Christian. So when he found out what his mission was, he refused to accept it, and he refused to order his men to attack his fellow Christians. And so the Roman emperor sent word that he was to obey his commands, and he still refused to do it. So to make a long story short, Maurice is beheaded along with most of his legion, and they become martyrs. And over a period of about 300 years in parts of France and Northern Europe, in Germany in particular, a cult of St. Maurice develops. It is said that he even carried the spear used to pierce the side of Christ. Maurice is so important that icons of St. Maurice were taken and put in front of crusading armies as they battled the Slavs in Eastern Europe. Now, I love this picture right here. It's one of my favorites, but I can't always show it. Because when I show this picture in public schools, either I show it very quickly, or if I linger on it, the children jump up and say, "He's so black, he's so ugly." I remember doing a presentation in San Antonio about 2 years ago with some black and Latino youth, and everything was going fine. It was another presentation that I wasn't getting paid for, but I was called upon to do it, and I believe in being a responsible member of my community, and when people want the information, even if I don't get paid, although I have bills just like everybody else, I will go for little or nothing. That's my job. It's not all about how much money you're going to make. Although everybody has financial needs, and I'm no exception to that. So I'm doing a presentation, and there was these young people who had not had much preparation for what they were about to see. Some of these kids was like, they were just grabbed off the street to fill up the room. And I decided I would give them something to do. One little boy in particular named Danny, who was 11 years old, looked like he had just come from the Congo. Black as could be, handsome little boy. And so I gave Danny the job of operating the slide projector. Danny sat there fine, there was no problem. And then half of the presentation went by, and I showed this piece. And Danny, who had been docile and quiet, all at once jumped up and said, "He looks like an ape." And another little black boy says, "He looks like a monkey." And they thought it was the funniest thing. And I was so wounded by that. I just had to sit down and take my seat. And I thought for a moment, maybe I should just cancel the presentation. Because it really disturbs me when we have the attitude that the more black you are, the more Africoid you are, the uglier you are. Because our standards of beauty have been established by people who don't look like you and I. And we march to their tune. That's what I was talking about, sis, when I said I want to get people to engage in critical thinking, and I'm not quite sure how to do that besides giving the information and showing the picture. I want you to begin to be more analytical and look beneath the surface of the new pictures that I've got of St. Maurice. And all of these come from Germany, from around the 12th or 14th century. You like that one? I've seen about 25 or 30 of them, and at some point in time I want to go to Eastern Europe and photograph a lot of these, but you hear about random attacks against black folk in Eastern Germany and in other parts of Eastern Europe. And I want to live a long time. I know I have a lot of work to do and I need to go to these places, but I suppose for me, I'm learning that when you go to one of these places, it's best to go prepared. And this is of a Norman knight. You may have heard of the Normans. In fact, there's a place in western France called Normandy. In 1944, I guess it was June or July, you have the D-Day, led by the British and the Americans. and they landed eventually at Normandy Beach. Well, the Normans were a group of people associated with that part of France, but apparently some of the Norman aristocracy had to be black. And you can't get any blacker than this brother right here. This comes to us from, I think, the 13th century, and this is on the cover of a book called Ancient and Modern Britons by a man named David Mcgrath. It is an excellent, excellent book. If you want something on the black presence in the British Isles, that's the book that you need to have. Now, I had something to do with the republication of that book. It was originally published, I think, in 1884 or thereabouts, and I met an older brother, he's probably an ancestor now, in Southern California about 1984, and he had seen some of the work I'd done for Ivan Van Sertima. He lived in Los Angeles, and he invited me to come and meet with him. He showed me this old manuscript called Ancient and Modern Britons, and I read through it, and I was just knocked out, because it talked about black people among the Vikings, black people in Scotland, black people in Ireland, black people in Wales, all over England, black queens, black Moors. I'd never seen anything like it. I didn't understand why. I didn't know about this man. And so the brother said, well, Runoko, I was thinking about having it reprinted. And I said, well, yeah, come on, let's do it. And so we worked on it. Can you all see? And I did a review for it in a book, and this is the photograph that we decided to use. Now, this picture, I originally found in a work by J.A. Rogers, a book called Nature Knows No Color Line. And I'll be honest with you, there's a white woman standing next to him, right behind him. And he has a strange look on her face, and she looks real bored too. So I figured I would physically separate them, and that's all we have surviving of her on the end over there. This is Saint Benedict the Moor. He's from Sicily. And Benedict is the founder of the Benedictine order of monks. Just to show you how you are sometimes able to reach a lot of people, I mentioned from time to time that I used to be a lecturer and a university professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I would teach graduate level courses on how to incorporate this information into the standard school curriculum. And I remember I taught the course during the summertime, and Hawaii is a beautiful place, I'm telling you. And you could see the ocean from your classroom. University of Hawaii at Manoa, beautiful place. I've never had that much fun lecturing in my life at any institution. And eventually the budget got cut, and that was the end of that. So now they bring me back from time to time as a consultant or lecturer. So I'm teaching a class of 17 adults, and of the 17, only 3 of them are black, only 3 of them are African. Most of them are Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos. But that doesn't matter to me. This information is for everybody. It's not just for black people. This is for everybody, particularly people who are open-minded. Because we're just trying to tell the truth. This isn't about bashing anybody. This isn't about teaching you to be angry or hate anybody. This is about teaching you what we consider, this is what we might call world history for a new generation. Okay? This is the missing pages of world history as we see it, and I'm trying to teach it the best I can. And so anybody who comes to me for information, whoever it is, I'm going to try to be fair and impartial. Naturally, I lean more towards black folks because I'm black. And I realize black people have the deepest needs, and I don't apologize for that. I'm an unashamedly race man. And my major mission in life, before I uplift humanity, is uplifting African people. And by uplifting African people, you uplift humanity as a whole. But charity starts at home. Okay? And all people have historians of their race. That's what I am. I'm a world historian, but I take pride in being a race man and a historian of the race in the same tradition as people like Edward Wilmot Blyton and Dr. Chancellor Williams. So I'm teaching the class, and word gets around to me, there was a rumor circulating that Runoko Rashidi was an angry young black man. I don't get called young that much anymore since I got this gray beard. And I heard about it. And the Japanese in particular were circulating this rumor. So I figured, well, let me nip it in the bud. And I said, you know, I am an angry young black man. But I'm not angry at you. So don't take it personal. Okay? I'm angry that we have been denied our place in history. And so one afternoon, I'm doing a seminar on the African presence in early Europe, and I showed this slide. And this old Japanese lady, she must have been about 80 years old. She says, I said, this is St. Benedict from Sicily. She says, is he the person who founded the Benedictine order of monks? I said, I really don't know. But I'll try to find out. I don't have most of my library in Hawaii. Most of this in Los Angeles, but I'll try to find out. So days passed, and finally toward the end of the semester, I said, I never did find that out. She said, that's okay, I found out. And he was the founder of the Benedictine order of monks, but I didn't know he was black, she told me. So the semester went by, and on the last day of class, they had a little tribute towards me, their professor, and I was very touched. And I had been told that the Japanese were very reserved and aloof and sullen, especially the women, which is their prerogative. And this little bitty lady, about this tall, must have been 80 years old, who wasn't teaching, she was just interested in information because we should all be lifelong students. During the celebration, came up to me in front of the whole class and gave me a big bear hug. And I was really moved by that because it showed me that this kind of thing can translate gender, race, culture, ethnicity. That somehow history can be used to rise above a lot of the things that we are involved with. Now this is Alejandro Medici, and he is the reigning Duke of Florence for about 20 years in medieval Europe, very handsome brother. And his father was a cardinal. You may have heard of the Medici family, or Medici. This is another piece from Germany. This is a nice piece too. This man is called Caspar, C-A-S-P-A-R. And this is I just found out in the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now that brother is very sharp, isn't he? I mean, a real dandy there. Now this represents another phase. This piece is from Munich, Germany, and this takes us to about 1500. And at this particular time, this is the advent of the slave trade. And you have African people. I showed you the first piece of the sister, who I said represented the first wave into Europe. And then I showed you images of Africans in ancient Greece and ancient Rome and Greek mythology, etc., etc. And then you have the Moors. It's another big push. You have black Vikings. You have a group in Ireland called the Fomorians, who are described as African sea rovers. You have Africans in Scotland. You have traditions in the book called the Mabinogion, a collection of Welsh folktales of African giants, of black men playing chess, of black queens. You have black people at the court of St. James in Scotland, etc., etc. And then you have another movement, and these are Africans who are pretty much brought into Europe as servants. They don't do a whole lot, and they don't come in large numbers, but they're almost like ornaments. And no aristocratic circle in Europe was complete without an African or two to adorn the place. This is one of those kinds of figures. This brother doesn't seem like he's pulling a plow.
So it's not like the little small, you can see the leaves, like about 4 or 5 inches.
I have this brother is from Austria, and you can see these people don't look like they're doing rough physical work. They're not working in the field. They, like I say, are almost ornaments. And this is a common theme in European art. And these sisters and brothers must have led very lonely lives.
Why would they want to have it?
Well, it's just like you want to have a poodle or something.
Oh.
I mean, it's the same way. I mean, it seems like a good thing to have. It's cute. Everybody else has one. Or have an African body servant. Or an African woman who helps the queen to get dressed. Are just Africans just stand there and look regal. It may sound silly, but that was definitely the trend. And you see a lot of these. Now, this man may have had more of a formal status. He may have even been a statesman. He's described as the court secretary in Sweden from 1760 to about 1814. We even know his name. His name is Adolf Badin, B-A-D-I-N. Now, you see how he is portrayed? I mean, real, almost dandified, brother. All the feathers, all of them are like that.
Okay, what was that in the playing?
Chess piece.
He's playing chess. I was mentioning that I think chess is an African game, and I think the reason for that is because of the prominence of the female. The dominant piece in chess is the queen. Now the king is supposed to be the one you're after, but the king is old and slow. He can't move too fast. He can only move one space at a time. The queen can do all kinds of stuff. She's the most powerful piece on the board. She pays great respect to the king, but the queen really runs it. That's an African tradition in many ways. The power behind the throne, in some cases on the throne. This comes from the Netherlands, and I was able to clip this out of a newspaper in Amsterdam. And what you see are two black men, really sharp, liveried up, red coat, blue breeches, white stockings, you know, and they, I guess it's the old form of driving Miss Daisy. I mean, you see what I'm talking about. And this was sold in an auction. But this really personifies what I meant. And you have lots of images like that. If you want more information, you can look at a book called The African Presence in Early Europe, edited by Ivan van Sertima. I even have a chapter in it myself. And this piece comes to us from Spain, I think, in the 15th century. Now, this is after the fall of the Moors. The Moors are conquered in 1492. And they give up the Alhambra in Granada. A Moorish leader who is very weak. Even his mother talked about it. Called him a punk in so many words. And saying you should have lived up to the traditions of your forefathers who fought. He surrendered the citadel to Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand and Isabella representing the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. And so the Moors give up. Many of them are ultimately expelled. Some of them went back to Africa, where they wreaked havoc. And with the wealth of the Jews and the technical expertise of the Moors, I think is what allowed Christopher Columbus to sail to the Western Hemisphere. Columbus sailed over here with the full support of Isabella in particular. Isabella was a fanatical Christian who dreamed of launching another crusade to take Palestine back, take what they call the Holy Land, back from the infidels, but how to finance it. So Columbus sells them on this idea that he would sail around the world and get these spices and bring them back, and they would have enough money to launch these crusades. That is really what a lot of the Columbus voyages was all about. I may have mentioned yesterday or the day before too, yesterday I suppose, that Columbus has a lot of responsibility for the transatlantic slave trade. That Columbus, on one of his voyages, perhaps the second one, brought, I think, 5 Native Americans from the Caribbean back to Spain. And they saw the possibilities of what might happen. The Native Americans, however, did not make good slaves. Many of them were either run away or they just died off from European diseases. They tried to take many Europeans out of Europe as indentured servants. But in order to have the labor supply that they needed, they would have had to depopulate half of Europe. So what about Africa? Africa is closer to the Americas than Europe or Asia. It had a large population used to agricultural labor. And so they were able to begin to take small numbers of Africans at first and bring them to the Western Hemisphere. And then they began to get concessions along the African coast. And they were able to build fortresses. And ultimately, they were able to overpower the Africans and pretty much take African people at will. It had nothing to do with race. It had nothing to do with the inferiority of African people or the superiority of Europeans. It was just a convenient thing. And then later on, as it got going, it took on racial overtones. And Europeans were taught that Africans were in fact subhuman, and that they had a duty to Christianize them. You enslave them, and you uplift their souls. And they were able to conquer enough of Africa to do this, and eventually, as a result of this enslavement process, they were able to eventually colonize Africa. When the abolition of slavery was talked about in the 19th century, I want you to understand, I know I'm digressing, but this is an important point. It wasn't because, for the most part, to benefit Africans. You do have some benevolent people who knew that slavery was a sin, but many people who finally got behind enslavement decided that we have enough slaves to fulfill our needs in the Western Hemisphere. So now, let's look at the richness of Africa itself. Let's keep the Africans in Africa and use them to exploit the natural resources of Africa. Now, this is very profound. White folks were not necessarily about the abolition of slavery because they thought it was going to do you some good. They just thought we should keep that labor supply in Africa. We need them over there more than we need them over here. Now, they may not have called it slavery. You call it imperialism or colonization, but the process is pretty much the same. So the same thing that is happening to us in the Western Hemisphere is happening to black and other colored populations around the world. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. At the same time. And it's at this time that a division is being made and the seeds of hatred are being sown. For them to say the Africans in Africa don't want you. You're not an African. You're an American. Even though you don't have the rights of other Americans, you're still not an African. And we have bought into that. Many of us say, thank God for slavery because at least it got us out of Africa. And many of us say, those Africans don't want us. They don't think we're Africans. How many of you have heard that? When I talk about freedom for Africa, I'm talking about a continental African Union where the resources of Africa are used for African people. We have to participate in that process because we have the technology and the resources that Africa needs. But if you don't think you're an African, if you think Africa is the worst place in the world, if it's a jungle inhabited by alligators, crocodiles, lions, and tigers, King Kong, Jimbo the Jungle Boy, and Tarzan, then we're never going to get it right. So whatever I'm talking about, if the presentation is a tribute to great African women, if it's called an expose of Greek culture, ultimately that is what I am trying to do. I'm trying to use this information to empower our people with the knowledge of who we are, what we have done, what we can do, and what is our historic duty to do. I don't believe that we were taken through that door of no return for no reason. Sisters and brothers, we have a mission and a destiny and a purpose, and it's time for us to step up to the plate. All right. Chevalier de St. George's. He went to France. Guadeloupe is a French-speaking island in the Caribbean, along with Haiti, and I think Martinique and one or two others. He became the greatest ice skater in France. The Olympics are on now. I was watching ice skating right before I came. He was one of the greatest swordsmen in France. And he was a great composer. I've actually had some of his music performed for me that he wrote in the 18th century. And again, brother, it's very sharp. But he was a duelist, and he was nobody to joke with. This is, again, Alexander Dumas. His father, too, was from the Caribbean. Now, I grew up with the idea that if you have any African ancestry at all, you're an African. They say if you have one drop of black blood, you're black in this country. But in many other parts of the world, it's just the opposite of that. So they would not see him in France as an African, I don't think. They would see him as French with African ancestry. And it does make a difference. But since we're about self-definition, I call him my brother. He still has the hair. Of course, this is the man who is the most prolific writer of his time. And he writes The Three Musketeers. And the movie that's out now, one of the hottest movies in America, The Count of Monte Cristo. And another movie that I've seen, The Man in the Iron Mask, and lots of other movies, lots of other books. The Black Tulip, The Black Corskin. He was very prolific. Unfortunately, he died very poor. He lost it all. He lived high on the heart. He lived large. And he died small. But he is a great writer, and his expressions come back to us and motivate us. A theme that the Imani Foundation could employ, and all of us could employ. Just like when I quoted earlier Terence Alfar, who says, I am a man, and therefore nothing human is alien to me. These expressions that live through the ages, or Imhotep, who gives us the expression, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, 5,000 years ago in Europe. The Egyptians who give us the expression, ignorance is evil, although we are told over here ignorance is bliss. It gives the expression, one for all and all for one. Now that's very profound, and that could be a rallying point. But the other expression that it gives us that I like a lot more, and that is, a man's mind is elevated to the status of the women with whom he associates. That's a statement for women in general, African women in particular. Queens of the universe. And he had a son, by the way, who became, I think, a member of the French Academy of Sciences. So you have 3 generations of Dumas. The elder Dumas, his daddy, who was a military man, who was an associate of Napoleon. You have this brother and the son who becomes a famous writer in his own right. This is Ibrahim Petrovich Hannibal. And this is the maternal great-grandfather of Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin. Now this brother begins his rise in the same ornamental fashion. He is captured in Africa. 4 points of origin are given for him. One is, oh, it's getting late, I'm going to pick it up. When you get talking, I tell you, forget about it. Some people say he's from Cameroon. Others would say he is from Nigeria. Some say he was from Ethiopia. Others say he was from Eritrea. As a little boy, about 1690, he is taken to Russia. He is adopted by the Tsar of Russia, Peter I. And Peter I takes a liking to him, adopts him, gives him his name, son of Peter or Petrovich. Sends him to France for a military education. He comes back to Russia. He becomes a general in a Russian army, probably an honorary title, and a famous engineer. Now he reaches back. His name is now Abraham Petrovich, but he reaches back and takes the name Hannibal from the African military genius, which would reflect a degree of African consciousness right there. And he has this son right here. This is, I think, Pushkin's father or grandfather. And finally, Pushkin himself, just a light-skinned African in Russia, who was just a fantastic figure to me. A ladies' man, a great writer, a great poet, a great intellect. He had a vocabulary of 20,000 words. And he is supposed to have more or less taught the Russian people their language. It's called the Russian Autumn, the Russian Morning, the Russian Springtime. This is a picture I took in one of his houses when he first got married in the north in St. Petersburg, a black statue of Pushkin. This is the whole statue, and this is Brother Runoko with the statue. Yeah. To put it in context. This is his library. Pushkin was so important that when he died, his library was kept intact. And many Russians actually stopped their clocks when they found out he died. So we know that he died at exactly 2:45 on the afternoon of January 29, 1837. And I didn't know if I was going to be able to afford it. Nobody was paying me to go, although I was asked to speak or present a paper. They said you have to come on your own. And it cost me about $1,500, which at that time to me was a lot of money. And I would call on the spirit of Pushkin to help take me to Russia. And I would go in my front yard in San Antonio with wine and vodka and pour it in the ground in the form of a libation ceremony to call on Pushkin. And I could look back and see my neighbors looking out their windows and saying, telling their children, don't mess with that man because he's crazy. But I went. And this is what, there I am again. My goodness, that's a nice picture, isn't it? In the library of Alexander Pushkin. And this is what you find there. You find these statues of black men breaking their chains in the 1830s in Russia. There's a close-up. There's another one. You can see? You see the chains down there? The same kind of hairstyle that we associated with the black people in Greece. This is a black man in the Caucasus region in 1913. So you could even say that you have black Caucasians if you wanted to go there.
We still got some.
This is, yeah, I know we do, but that's a different kind of black Caucasian. At the house people. This is Queen Charlotte Sophia, who was the Queen of England at the time of the American Revolution. Sometimes she's just simply referred to as the consort of King George III. And as we wind down in the African presence in Europe, I did want to give you a full presentation. This is Aliado Equiano. He is an abolitionist and a man of letters. I think he wrote or spoke 5 languages. I got this picture in Birmingham, England. And it's a beautiful, isn't that a beautiful portrait? Yeah. You have several, you've got a lot of Africans like this. You have another one called Mustafa Sabasa. And this is the goddess Aset and the child Heru. I told you the Osirian drama yesterday in Newport News, so I won't deal with it again. But I think you basically know the story of the African woman who, with her undying love, resurrected her husband and gave birth to a child that is the first example of a hero. In fact, his name was Heru. And she becomes the prototype for images of Mary and Jesus. And you find particular examples of them among the Black Madonna and Child all over Europe. This is from Sweden. These are considered miracle workers, and their miracle working power is derived from their Black. It's a very good book called The Cult of the Black Virgin that you might want to read by Ian Begg, B-E-G-G. This is my own picture that I took in Russia in 1999, and this is actually in the Kremlin. It's got to be at least 800 years old. And you can see the Black Madonna. This is my own picture, original photograph that you may not have ever seen before. It's in my book. And you have the images of the Black Madonna and the infant Jesus. Jesus has a nice little natural on his head. And I was told that the reason they look black is because the people who paint these use bad paint and they turn black. Now, that's really what they told me in the church. And there's a bunch of them. They all turn black. Only the face, hands, and feet were the places where the bad paint was applied. Come on now. Other times people will tell you that the reason they are black is because the worshipers used a lot of incense and candles and collected on the face, hands, and feet of the Madonnas, like this one right here. And this is another beautiful one. So I mean, they're really beautiful, and they're said to work miracles. I've actually read prayers written to these Madonnas. One of them, in fact, some of them actually have the name Aset and Heru, or Isis and Horus, carved on the figurines. The city of Paris is named after Isis. Isis is the Greek name for Aset. The African name is more important than the throne. That's why I try to use African names, because they have names that mean something. Most of us, when we get a name, it's because it sounds cute. You know, Eddie Murphy would joke about that. Like, he would say we would have names like Teflon and things like that, because it has a nice sound to it. But you don't know what it means. But in Africa, the names have meaning. So the name for that deity is Aset, and that means the throne. And you oftentimes find her as in the image of a black woman with a throne on top of her head. And in the city of Paris is named after the Greek version, and that is Para-Isidus, or the Grove of Isis. That was the basis of the city of Paris. And finally, let me just show you, as I close down, let us honor our ancestors, as our brother showed us with the libation ceremony, and just show a few images of some of the African scholars who have paved the way. This is George Wells Parker, a real race man, and one of my favorite people of modern times. He was a Garveyite. He was a founder of what's called the Hamitic League of the world. The word Hamite, like Moor or Kush or Ethiopian, is a term that was used to denote black folks at one time or another. And Parker wrote a paper that was presented before the Omaha Philosophical Society in 1916, April 1st, called The African Origins of the Grecian Civilization, way back in 1916. And he literally lost his mind. He went crazy. He was sent to a mental institution, and that's the last we hear of him. I hope that doesn't happen to me. But black folks run anybody crazy if you ain't careful. But that's the price you pay. Because I love black people. So, George Wells Parker, Ashe.
20 minutes before we got to be out.
Yeah. Ashe just means, and so it is. It's an affirmation. This is Nnamdi Ezekwe. He became the head of state of Nigeria in 1934 in Crisis magazine. He wrote an article on the Negro and Greek mythology. This is Carter G. Woodson, the founder of Negro History Week in 1926 that became African Heritage Month. This is Joel Augustus Rogers from Jamaica. Rogers is one of the greatest historians we've ever produced, and Rogers was able to popularize African history. He wrote in a manner that a lot of people would find very readable. This is J.C. Mcgrath Johnson. If you want good works on the Moors, this is the man for you. This brother is born in Ghana. I didn't bring a picture of George G.M. James, I'm sad to say, who wrote the book Stolen Legacy, which really dealt with the African origin of Greek philosophy. George G.M. James was a Mason. This is Edward Scobie, who wrote a book called Black Britannia. He was from Dominica in the Caribbean, and he died just a couple years ago, and he was the world's leading authority on the African presence in Europe. So sisters and brothers, we diverged from our purpose a little bit, but I think that everybody was able to get a great deal out of the presentation. I take a train tomorrow morning for New York City, and I don't know when I'll be back in Norfolk. But it has been a full experience. I'm very grateful to have had a chance to interact with you. I hope that you are all able to get something out of the presentation and you feel like tonight was not in vain. I want to thank Brother Seko in particular and the other members of the Imani Foundation, and I hope it's not the last time we get an opportunity to have a discussion of this nature.
Thanks, Sister. So
we're running out of time now. We may have time for 2 or 3 questions or comments if you have them. And again, I do have the books for sale that I would be happy to autograph. It would be nice to be able to go back to New York with a real light suitcase.